The forest is never truly silent. Twigs snap in the distance. Shadows shift between the trees, and sometimes, just sometimes, a low, guttural sound echoes through the night. Those who have heard it say it isn't a bear, it isn't a wolf, it's something else, something watching. For centuries, whispers of a towering figure covered in thick, matted fur have crept through campfire tales and frantic eyewitness reports. Tracks too large for any known creature have been found in the deep woods, vanishing into untouched wilderness. Some call it folklore, others swear they've seen it with their own eyes. But whether you believe it or not, one thing is certain: the legend of Bigfoot is far from dead. The Cascade Mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, a thick expanse of towering firs and mist-choked valleys. The range had always been a place of whispered legends, the kind of stories old-timers told over campfires, tales of hikers vanishing without a trace, of guttural howls echoing through the ravines at night. Locals warned visitors to stick to the trails, but Jason Whitmore and his friends were in search of something untouched. It was the summer of 1998, and a weekend camping trip felt like the perfect escape from the pressures of their final college year. Jason, along with Emily Grayson, Mark Daly, Rachel Connors, and Todd Fisher, had packed up their gear and driven deep into the Cascades, determined to find a secluded waterfall Mark had read about in an old hiking forum. The road leading up to their starting point was a winding mess of dirt and gravel, potholes deep enough to swallow a tire. The drive itself took nearly 4 hours, with only the occasional abandoned gas station breaking up the monotony of endless trees and mountains in the distance. At one such gas station, an old man watched them from his rocking chair, chewing on an unlit cigar. His skin was weathered, his beard a tangled mess of white and gray. When they stopped for supplies, he approached their car, peering inside with a look of mild amusement. "Stick to the trails, kids," he muttered, shaking his head as they paid for their snacks and fuel. Mark had laughed it off, saying the man was just trying to scare them, but the way his eyes lingered, dark and knowing, sent a brief chill through Emily's spine. The first day of hiking had been uneventful, aside from the nagging feeling that they were being watched. The deeper they trekked, the more the forest seemed to swallow them whole. The sunlight barely cut through the thick canopy, and the oppressive silence felt unnatural. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of their boots against damp earth. They stopped for lunch by a creek, the water ice-cold and clear as glass. Rachel snapped a few photos on her disposable camera, joking about capturing a Bigfoot sighting. Todd, always the skeptic, scoffed and tossed a pebble into the water. They reached a clearing just before dusk and set up camp, spreading their sleeping bags in a tight circle around the fire pit. Mark took out a flask of whiskey, passing it around as they roasted hot dogs over the flames. The laughter came easy, but underneath it all, there was an unspoken unease. Emily noticed it first, the way the trees seemed too still, the way the shadows stretched unnaturally long. She thought about voicing her concern, but what could she say? That the forest felt wrong? She shook it off, taking a sip from the flask, feeling the burn of alcohol warm her throat. At first they sounded distant, like trees groaning under the wind's weight, but the wind was dead that night, and the noises soon grew closer. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the perimeter of their camp. Jason had joked about it being a bear, but the moment he said it, the footsteps stopped, not faded, just stopped. The group exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado slipping. Mark shone his flashlight into the trees, but the beam revealed only endless darkness between the trunks. They should have packed up right then and there. Sometime after midnight, Emily was jolted awake by the sound of snapping branches. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows over the campsite. Jason and Todd were already awake, staring into the blackness beyond the trees. And then it came, an ear-splitting roar that shook the ground beneath them. Something massive tore through the campsite, a dark blur of muscle and fury. Rachel barely had time to scream before she was yanked into the darkness, her flashlight tumbling to the ground, its beam illuminating a brief, sickening glimpse of her twisted limbs as they disappeared into the trees. Panic erupted. Jason grabbed a hunting knife from his pack, but it was useless. A massive hand, if it could even be called that, swiped him aside like a rag doll. He crashed against a tree, his head splitting open on impact. Todd and Mark bolted, but the thing was faster. A guttural snarl cut through the night, followed by Todd's agonized shriek. Emily barely saw what happened to Mark, only the bloodied remains that hit the forest floor seconds later. She ran, blindly, desperately, branches tearing at her skin. The sound of heavy footfalls pursued her, but she didn't dare look back. The terrain was merciless, slopes plunging into unseen depths, tree roots reaching out like grasping hands. She stumbled, fell, got up, and kept running. Her breath was ragged, her legs screaming in protest. The only thing keeping her moving was sheer terror. The forest felt endless, a maze of darkness and unseen horrors. The air was thick with the scent of blood, of earth churned up by something far too large to be human. At some point, she must have blacked out because the next thing she knew, she was staggering onto the highway, disoriented and covered in blood that wasn't entirely her own. A trucker spotted her, hitting the brakes so hard the tires screeched against the asphalt. He jumped out, his face going pale at the sight of her. Emily tried to speak, to explain, but the words came out in a broken, frantic mess. He wrapped a blanket around her and called the police, his hands shaking as he dialed. The authorities arrived within the hour, skeptical but concerned. They found the campsite easily enough, but what they discovered left even the most seasoned officers shaken. The remains of Jason, Mark, Rachel, and Todd were barely recognizable, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, their bodies torn apart with a force no bear could have managed. Deep claw marks were gouged into the surrounding trees, too high to be from any known predator. The official report later attributed the deaths to a bear attack. No one questioned it too much. It was the easy answer, the one that made sense. But Emily never accepted that explanation. She knew what she saw, something with glowing eyes, something impossibly tall, its massive form silhouetted against the trees. She never went near the woods again. The Ural Mountains in the winter of 1975 were a frozen wasteland, a place where only the most hardened souls dared to venture. The Soviet Union had long used the remote expanse for everything from military training to classified research, but to 4 geology students, it was simply an isolated field site for their expedition. Ivan Mikhailov, Sergei Petrov, Oksana Belova, and Dmitry Antonov had been sent by the Leningrad Institute of Earth Sciences to conduct seismic studies in an abandoned logging outpost, a place long forgotten by most, but still standing against the relentless wind and snow. The journey to the outpost was grueling. They traveled by train and then by snowmobile, their breath freezing in the air as they navigated the treacherous terrain. The last stretch of their journey took them through thickly forested mountains, where the snowdrifts could swallow a man whole, and the wind howled through the trees like a living thing. The locals in the last village they passed through warned them against continuing. One old woman had said that the forest held secrets, clutching Oksana's hand with an urgency that sent a shiver down her spine. Strange things happen to those who go too far. Sergei had laughed it off, calling it superstition, but even Ivan, the most pragmatic of the group, had felt uneasy as they pressed on. When they finally reached the outpost, the sight of the dilapidated wooden structure did little to ease their nerves. The cabin was a relic of a bygone era, its roof sagging under decades of snow, its walls weathered and brittle from the elements. The isolation was absolute. The nearest village was over 60 kilometers away, and radio communication with their superiors was their only link to civilization. Despite the eerie atmosphere, their spirits were high as they unpacked their supplies. The 4 of them had been on expeditions before, enduring worse conditions than this. Dmitry got a fire going while Oksana set up the equipment, double-checking the seismograph and taking preliminary readings. Ivan recorded notes in his leather-bound journal, meticulously detailing their arrival and first observations. The first few nights passed uneventfully, aside from the eerie stillness that settled over the forest after dark. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their blackened branches swaying only slightly under the weight of the wind. The temperature plummeted well below freezing, the air so dry it cracked their lips and stung their eyes. Inside the cabin, they huddled around the stove, swapping stories and playing chess to pass the time. It was on the fourth night that everything changed. That evening, Dmitri stepped outside to relieve himself and returned pale, swearing he had seen movement just beyond the tree line. He murmured that it was taller than any man, shivering, though not from the cold. The others dismissed his fear as a trick of the darkness, but an uneasy tension settled over them. Their last radio transmission, logged at around 9:17 p.m., had been brief. Ivan reported worsening weather conditions, but assured their team leader that everything was under control. Then, silence. Repeated attempts to re-establish contact failed. The blizzard that rolled in over the next several days made any rescue efforts impossible. When the search team finally reached the site a week later, they found a scene of horror. The cabin door had been torn from its hinges, its shattered remains half buried in the snow. Inside, blood was splattered across the walls and floor, frozen in grotesque streaks where it had sprayed from unseen wounds. The overturned furniture suggested a struggle, but no human tracks led away from the site. Only a set of footprints, nearly twice the size of a man's, pressed deep into the snow and vanishing into the tree line. Ivan's body was found first, lying just outside the cabin. His limbs were twisted at unnatural angles, his eyes wide open in terror. Sergei and Oksana's remains were discovered several meters away, partially buried beneath a layer of fresh snow. Oksana's skull had been crushed, as if by immense pressure, while Sergei's torso had been shredded apart, his ribs splayed open like the carcass of an animal. Of Dmitri, there was no trace. The rescue team documented everything, from the deep claw marks gouged into the walls of the cabin to the eerie silence that had settled over the area. One of the investigators, an experienced tracker, examined the massive footprints and muttered something about not belonging to any bear. His report was never made public. Soviet officials quickly classified the incident, attributing the deaths to a bear attack despite the glaring inconsistencies. The local villagers, however, whispered another explanation. The region had long been the subject of folklore, stories of towering beasts that roamed the deep wilderness, their presence known only by fleeting glimpses and the unnatural silence that followed in their wake. The rescue team members who had seen the footprints were reassigned, their reports buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. No further expeditions were ever sent to the outpost. The cabin, now a ruin, remains untouched, a frozen monument to the fate of those who had dared to disturb whatever lurked in the Ural Mountains. The Amazon rainforest stretched endlessly, a dense, humid expanse teeming with life and secrets hidden beneath its emerald canopy. In 2003, Elias Mercer, a seasoned travel writer, set off alone into its depth, determined to find an uncharted waterfall rumored only in tribal legends. Unlike the usual tourist ventures, this was personal. He had heard whispers of something extraordinary, something the modern world had never documented. His journey began in the town of Manaus, where he chartered a boat to take him upriver. The farther he traveled, the thinner the connection to the modern world became. The river itself was a winding artery cutting through the jungle, its dark waters home to caimans, anacondas, and unseen creatures lurking just below the surface. Dense mist rolled in at dawn, clinging to the water like a ghostly veil. Along the banks, distant figures, local villagers, watched him with wary eyes, offering no greetings, only silent warnings. João, the boatman he had hired, refused to go beyond a certain point. "This is where I turn back," he said firmly, his expression unreadable. "Go further. You go alone." Elias, undeterred, continued on foot, hacking through dense undergrowth, his body drenched in sweat from the oppressive heat. The air was thick with humidity, making every breath feel heavy. The jungle was alive with movement. Monkeys chattered from the treetops, vibrant macaws flitted overhead, and the distant growls of unseen predators reminded him he was far from civilization. He moved cautiously, documenting his surroundings in a worn leather journal. The deeper he ventured, the more surreal the forest became. He saw trees twisted into unnatural shapes, their bark carved with symbols he couldn't understand. Strange, whispering sounds echoed through the jungle, like voices carried by the wind. At times, he felt eyes watching him from behind the foliage, yet when he turned, nothing was there. At night, the jungle took on an entirely different character. The towering trees became shadows against the night sky, their canopies forming a ceiling that blocked out the stars. The air was thick with the chorus of nocturnal creatures, chirping insects, croaking frogs, and distant howls. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves hung heavy. He set up a small camp in a clearing, eating from his rations and recording notes on indigenous myths surrounding the region. Fascinated by the stories of spirits and creatures lurking in the deep jungle, by the third night, something changed. The jungle grew eerily silent, the constant hum of insects and birds fading into an unnatural stillness. The usual rustling of leaves, the distant splashes in the river, all of it had ceased. Something heavy moved in the underbrush, keeping its distance but always present. Elias gripped his machete, scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. A deep, guttural growl reverberated from the jungle. It was unlike anything he had heard before. Low, resonant, filled with an intelligence that sent chills down his spine. The sound carried through the trees, circling him. The air thickened, turning oppressive, and his fire flickered as if struggling to stay alive. A foul odor filled the clearing, a pungent mix of decay and damp fur. Then it came. A blur of movement shot from the darkness. Elias barely had time to react before something yanked him off his feet with terrifying force. He hit the ground hard, his breath knocked from his lungs. Scrambling, he shone his flashlight towards the movement. A massive, fur-covered shape loomed before him, red eyes gleaming in the darkness. Its breath came in heavy, snarling bursts, like a beast tasting the air. Elias bolted, crashing through the undergrowth, branches clawing at his skin, roots threatening to trip him. The creature followed, its footfalls impossibly heavy, each one vibrating through the ground like distant thunder. He could feel its presence behind him, closing the distance. Just as he reached a steep ravine, he leapt, plunging into the darkness below. The impact left him bruised and gasping in the shallow water of a hidden stream. He lay there for hours, shivering, listening. The jungle above was silent once more. The thing had stopped chasing him, or perhaps it was watching, waiting. He lay there, trembling, too afraid to move. As dawn broke, he cautiously made his way out of the stream, his limbs aching from the fall. His flashlight was broken, his provisions scattered. He followed the river, hoping it would lead him back. The trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted limbs almost human-like in their formations. He found carvings in the rocks along the river, crude depictions of a monstrous figure with a single, staring eye. The word Mapinguari was etched in the stone, the very name João had muttered before. By noon, he stumbled his way back to the main river, where João was waiting. The boatman took one look at him, his torn clothes, his wide, haunted eyes, and said nothing. They left without a word, the silence thick between them. Back in Manaus, Elias tried to rationalize what had happened. The official report claimed he had been attacked by a rogue jaguar, but he knew better. The claw marks, the sheer force, the intelligence behind those eyes. No jaguar could have done that. His notes, filled with frantic scribbles, were the only proof of what he had seen. Weeks later, nightmares plagued him. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the guttural growl echoing in his ears. He began seeing shadows in the corners of his apartment, shapes that seemed to vanish when he turned to look. His hands shook when he tried to write, the words blurring together. He tried to push the memories away, to tell himself it was his imagination, but deep down, he knew. The jungle had not forgotten him. Then, João disappeared. The locals claimed he had gone back to the rainforest, abandoning his life in Manaus without a trace. Elias searched for answers, but the villagers only shook their heads, their expressions wary. Some things are not meant to be disturbed, one old man muttered. He knows that now, and so should you. Elias left Brazil soon after, but he never truly escaped. In quiet moments, when the world was still, he swore he could hear it. That same low, guttural growl resonating from the darkness beyond his window. And somewhere, deep in the jungle, the Mapinguari still waited, watching, remembering the man who had trespassed where he did not belong. The Brecon Beacons in Wales have always been a place of myth and mystery. Nestled among rolling green hills and mist-laden valleys, the region has long been the subject of eerie folklore. Stories passed down for generations tell of the wild man of the hills, a towering figure that supposedly roams the mountains, watching, waiting. Most dismissed it as a legend, something to scare children away from wandering too far. But in the summer of 1954, one man, Gareth Morgan, ventured into those hills alone, unaware that he was about to become part of the legend. Gareth had always been drawn to the wild, to the quiet solitude of nature. A school teacher by trade, he spent his weekends exploring the countryside, mapping trails, and finding peace away from the world. That summer, he set out on a solo camping trip, planning to spend 2 nights deep in the Beacons, following an old shepherd's path that had long been abandoned. He carried little, a bedroll, some food, and a notebook to record his thoughts. It was meant to be a retreat, a brief escape from the monotony of daily life. The first day passed in quiet serenity. He hiked the hills, traced the contours of forgotten stone walls, and rested by a bubbling stream. At dusk, he set up camp in a clearing near a dense forest, the dark tree lines standing like a wall against the open hills. There was an eerie stillness to the place, but Gareth chalked it up to the remoteness of the area. As he settled by his small fire, he let the hush of the wilderness envelop him, the only sound the distant call of a nightbird. That first night, something felt off. He awoke to silence, not the peaceful stillness of nature, but an unnatural absence of sound. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, nothing. The fire had died to embers, leaving only a faint glow. He sat up, the hairs on his arms prickling. A sensation of being watched crept over him, so strong it was almost tangible. He scanned the trees, but they stood in mute darkness. With a deep breath, he forced himself to lie back down, convincing himself it was just the isolation playing tricks on his mind. The second day brought more exploration. Deep in the valley, he stumbled upon an old shepherd's hut, its roof half collapsed, the wooden beams sagging with age. Inside, a single chair faced the doorway, as though someone had just been sitting there. He hesitated, the silence pressing in. A gust of wind rattled the loose planks, making him shiver despite the summer warmth. The feeling of unease lingered, a whisper at the back of his mind, but he forced himself to move on. As night fell, the oppressive stillness returned. The usual chorus of nocturnal creatures was absent once more. Gareth sat by the fire, trying to shake the feeling of something unseen lurking just beyond the light. Then, a sound, low, guttural, distant. At first, he thought it was the wind moaning through the valleys, but then it came again, closer this time. A deep, distorted howl, almost human but too unnatural. He reached for his flashlight and shone it toward the tree line. The beam barely cut through the thick shadows, but for a brief moment, something reflected back. 2 red eyes, impossibly high off the ground, unblinking. A heavy footstep sounded, then another, slow and deliberate. His breath hitched as he realized, whatever it was circling him. A rush of movement, a shape massive and indistinct, charged from the dark. Gareth barely had time to react before something slammed into him, sending him sprawling. The firelight caught glimpses, a hulking figure covered in matted hair, its limbs long and unnaturally jointed, its eyes glowing like embers. He scrambled to his feet and ran, heart pounding, breath ragged. The ground blurred beneath him as he fled, the creature's heavy steps crashing through the undergrowth behind him. He didn't stop running until he reached a farmstead at dawn, his clothes torn, his body scratched and bruised. The farmer who found him barely recognized the man beneath the sheer terror on his face. Authorities searched the area but found no trace of the creature. The official explanation was a wolf attack, despite wolves having been extinct in Wales for over 100 years. Gareth never spoke of what he saw that night, not publicly, but those who knew him said he was never the same. The quiet certainty in his eyes had vanished, replaced by a haunted silence. And though he never returned to the Brecon Beacons, he would always flinch at the mention of red eyes watching in the dark. The Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee have long been shrouded in mist and mystery. The dense forests, stretching for miles with little human interference, have always held stories. Some whispered in fear, others buried under official explanations. The isolation of the mountains, the endless canopy that swallowed the sky, made it a place where things could disappear without a trace. In 2020, 6 hikers set out on a 3-day trek through this wilderness, unaware that they would not all make it back. Brandon Cooper, Lisa Monroe, Derek Allen, Sophie Hayes, Tim Watson, and Jessica Lee were experienced hikers, familiar with the unpredictability of nature. They had planned a route that would take them through some of the most scenic, yet remote sections of the national park. The first day was perfect. Clear skies, cool mountain air, and trails that seemed to stretch endlessly into the wild. Birds flitted through the branches. The distant sound of a flowing stream accompanied their trek, and the hum of insects filled the air. They set up camp near a ridge, telling stories around the fire and enjoying the isolation. By the second day, the atmosphere had changed. The further they hiked, the quieter the forest became. The usual sounds of the wild, the chatter of birds, the rustling of squirrels, faded into an eerie silence. Sophie was the first to mention it, glancing around with unease. "It's too quiet," she murmured, more to herself than to the group. Derek dismissed her concern with a laugh, but even he seemed on edge. The weather shifted suddenly that afternoon. A storm rolled in from the west, dark clouds swallowing the sky, and a chilling wind whipping through the trees. Rain poured down in thick sheets, drenching them within minutes. The planned campsite for the night was still miles away, and the slick, muddy trail became treacherous. That was when they stumbled upon the cabin. It stood alone in a small clearing, barely visible through the downpour. The structure was old, its wooden walls warped by time and weather. The windows were broken, and the front door hung slightly ajar. Despite its abandoned state, it offered shelter. Inside, the air was musty, the scent of damp wood and decay lingering in every corner. The floorboards groaned beneath their weight as they stepped inside, shaking off the rain. The cabin was a single room, with a stone fireplace against one wall and an old rusted bed frame in the corner. Tattered curtains fluttered slightly in the wind seeping through the broken windows. Something about the place felt wrong, but the storm outside left them no choice. That night, as the rain hammered against the roof and the wind howled through the trees, something pounded on the walls. At first they thought it was the wind, branches being thrown against the cabin by the howling gusts. But then came the heavy, deliberate thuds, rhythmic and calculated. The sound moved around the cabin, circling them. Tim, the bravest among them, peered out through a gap in the wooden slats. His sharp intake of breath was the only warning before he was yanked through the broken window, his screams swallowed by the storm. Panic erupted. Derek and Sophie rushed to barricade the entrance while Brandon and Lisa tried to shine their flashlights into the surrounding darkness. For a moment, they saw it, something standing at the tree line, massive, hunched, covered in matted fur. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the weak light like an animal's. But this was no bear. It stood upright, impossibly tall, and it was watching them. Sophie whimpered, pressing her back against the wall. Jessica clutched a knife, though her hands shook violently. The pounding on the walls resumed, harder this time, rattling the very foundation of the cabin. The thing outside let out a low, guttural growl, a sound so deep they felt it in their bones. Then, the door splintered. The force of the impact sent Derek stumbling backward. The flashlight slipped from his grasp, spinning across the floor. In the disorienting flashes of light, they saw glimpses, thick limbs, elongated fingers tipped with claws, breath steaming in the cold night air. Then came the screams. By morning, 4 of them were dead, ripped apart as if by massive claws. Blood streaked the wooden walls, deep gashes carved into the floorboards. The storm had passed, leaving only an eerie stillness in its wake. Brandon and Lisa, the only survivors, had managed to escape by squeezing through a small opening beneath the cabin and running blindly into the forest. They didn't stop until they reached a ranger station miles away, their bodies bruised, their minds shattered. When the authorities arrived, the site was declared a tragic bear attack, though no one could explain the claw marks etched into the wooden beams, marks that stood nearly 8 feet off the ground. Lisa refused to speak to the press. Brandon, however, told a different story, one of a creature standing upright, of intelligent eyes that gleamed in the darkness, but no one believed him. And deep in the Appalachian wilderness, the truth remains buried in shadow. Brandon eventually left Tennessee, relocating to a city far from the mountains. He tried to move on, but the memories haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flash of glowing eyes in the dark and heard the pounding against the cabin walls. He avoided forests altogether, never venturing into wooded areas, even in broad daylight. Lisa, on the other hand, disappeared from public view. She refused interviews, changed her contact information, and never returned to hiking. Some who knew her claimed she suffered from terrible nightmares, waking up screaming about something watching her from the trees. Years later, a new hiking group stumbled upon the remnants of the old cabin. They found scratches still etched deep into the wooden beams, their edges worn but unmistakable. The site had been untouched since the night of the incident. Among the debris, they uncovered something else, a torn piece of fabric, soaked in long-dried blood, caught on a jagged splinter of wood. The discovery reignited old rumors, whispers of something lurking in the Appalachian wilderness, waiting, watching, choosing its next victims. In the winter of 1987, 4 experienced mountaineers, Nathan Carter, Olivia Singh, Michael Turner, and Hiroshi Yamamoto, set off on an expedition to the Annapurna region of Nepal. Their goal was to document rare wildlife and test the limits of human endurance in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Each had extensive experience with extreme conditions, yet none were prepared for what awaited them. The journey began smoothly. Their guide, a Sherpa named Tenzing, led them along an isolated trail, warning them of the dangers beyond the mapped routes. Stories of avalanches, hidden crevasses, and brutal cold were common among climbers. But Tenzing spoke in hushed tones about another threat, the Banjakri, an ancient legend of a monstrous, fur-covered being that roamed the high altitudes. He claimed that those who saw its glowing eyes were never seen again. The mountaineers dismissed the warnings as folklore meant to keep outsiders from wandering too far. By the 5th day, they had reached an altitude of 17,000 feet, setting up camp in a snow-covered valley beneath jagged cliffs. The terrain was unforgiving, sheer drops on either side, and only a narrow, icy path connecting their position to safer ground. The night was eerily silent, except for the howling wind. Olivia, the team's biologist, had gone out to set up motion-sensitive cameras to capture footage of local wildlife when she suddenly disappeared. One moment she was within sight, adjusting the camera's angle. The next, she was gone. The team fanned out, shouting her name, but there was no response. Fresh snowfall had covered any tracks she might have left behind. Hiroshi and Nathan spent hours searching in the bitter cold, retracing their steps and calling out, but there was no sign of her. Michael suggested she may have fallen into a crevasse, but there were no open cracks nearby. It was as if she had simply vanished into the night. As the temperature plummeted, the team had no choice but to retreat to their tents and hope she would return. The following morning, their worst fears were confirmed. Hiroshi's body was found half buried in the snow a few hundred meters from camp. His spine was snapped, his limbs twisted unnaturally, as if he had been flung with immense force. His face was frozen in an expression of pure terror, his mouth locked open in a silent scream. There were no signs of a struggle, no tracks leading to or from the body. The wind had erased any possible clues. Panic set in. Nathan and Michael debated turning back, but the nearest village was days away, and the growing storm threatened to trap them in the mountains. Packing up as quickly as possible, they decided to descend immediately. Tenzing, their guide, had left the day before to arrange for additional supplies and was unaware of what had happened. They were alone. That night, as they huddled in their tent, an unrelenting blizzard engulfed the mountainside, burying their camp under layers of snow. Then came the sound, deep, guttural breathing just beyond the thin fabric of the tent. At first, they thought it was the wind playing tricks on them, but then something massive brushed against the tent wall, casting a hulking shadow in the moonlight. The scent of damp fur and decay filled the air. Then the tent collapsed. Michael screamed as he was dragged out into the storm. Nathan fumbled for his ice axe but could see nothing beyond the swirling snow. He heard the frantic scuffle of boots on ice, Michael's muffled cries, and then nothing. The wind howled, drowning out any other sounds. Nathan, paralyzed by fear, remained hidden beneath the collapsed tent, heart pounding in his chest. When dawn arrived, Michael was gone. Bloodstains dotted the snow, trailing off toward the cliffs. Too exhausted and terrified to continue searching, Nathan gathered what he could and set off alone, stumbling through waist-high drifts of snow, his limbs numb from the cold. Hours later, he collapsed near a frozen river, barely conscious when a group of Sherpas discovered him. He was incoherent, suffering from frostbite and shock. When he finally recovered in a makeshift medical hut, Nathan described what had happened. He spoke of glowing eyes watching them from the ridges, of something enormous moving with impossible speed, of the sheer terror that had gripped him when the tent fell. But when he tried to explain what he saw, the doctors exchanged uneasy glances. The official report attributed the deaths to an avalanche, a common explanation for missing climbers in the region. No bodies were recovered, and with the heavy snowfall, no further investigation was conducted. The incident was quietly brushed aside as yet another tragic mountaineering accident. However, among the local Sherpas, whispers of the Banjakri persisted. They refused to return to that valley, claiming it was cursed. One elderly guide, after hearing Nathan's account, simply nodded and muttered, "You saw it. You are lucky to be alive." Nathan never climbed again. He withdrew from the mountaineering community, plagued by nightmares of glowing eyes in the dark, of unseen horrors lurking in the snow. He spent years researching similar accounts, finding unsettling similarities in reports from other climbers who had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. As the years passed, Nathan became more reclusive, haunted by the memories of that fateful expedition. He pored over historical accounts of strange disappearances in the Himalayas, finding that unexplained deaths and vanishing climbers had been recorded for centuries. The deeper he delved, the more he realized that their experience was not unique. Tales from Tibetan monks, whispered stories from remote villages, and even classified military reports all pointed to something lurking in the high peaks, beyond the reach of human civilization. Some believed the Banjakri was an undiscovered species, a relic from a time before man conquered the earth. Others thought it was a guardian spirit, punishing those who dared to trespass too far. But no matter the interpretation, the outcome was always the same. Those who saw the creature rarely lived to tell the tale. Nathan's final years were spent in quiet paranoia. He refused to sleep near windows, constantly feeling watched. On more than one occasion, he claimed to have seen a shadowy figure in the snow during particularly harsh winters, though no footprints were ever found. He died in 2014, never fully able to escape the horrors of what he had witnessed. To this day, his account remains one of the most chilling, unsolved incidents in the Himalayas. Whether it was an undiscovered predator, a freak accident, or something far more sinister, no one will ever truly know. But those who hear Nathan's story often find themselves thinking twice before venturing too deep into the mountains, where the wind carries whispers of ancient things that were never meant to be seen.